So now at this point, let's go ahead and move on to talk about the cerebellum. So you can kind of see a few of the different parts of the cerebellum. That includes the lateral cerebellum, which are on either side, and then the part in the middle called the vermis. There are actually three parts, as you can kind of see in this picture. Only two of them are actually shown here. So it's actually made up of three parts. The final one has a really cool name called the floccular nodular lobe. The reason we called this the cerebellum is because the cerebellum literally translates to little brain. So if you actually look at this picture, and especially if you kind of look at it from a sagittal view where the brain is to the side, it does actually look like a little brain. It has a cortex, it has white matter, and it also has deep nuclei. So the three different parts are actually devoted to different aspects related to movement. So the lateral hemispheres play a role in the timing of movements and coordinating those movements and helping with synchrony. How fast do the movements need to be? The vermis is kind of in the middle, which you can see here. And the vermis is largely there to help maintain posture via the spinocerebellar tract, making use of those proprioceptors to kind of help position in space and muscle and joint position. And then finally, the floccular nodular lobe is in front of the vermis at the base of the cerebellum, and it's largely there to help maintain balance. Now, when you have damage to areas in the motor system, so I've mentioned that the basal ganglia and the cerebellum are also involved in movement. Anytime that you have a motor disorder, we typically tend to break that down into a few different types. So there's a difference between a disorder known as an apraxia compared to something like ataxia. So with apraxia, you have difficulty performing purposeful movements, basically intended movements, like moving in response to verbal commands. So if I tell you brush your teeth or show me how you brush your teeth, um, you would be able to do that. Now, this can happen for a variety of different reasons. It could be due to damage to the corpus callosum, language information in the left hemisphere isn't being processed by the right. And so, because of that, because you don't understand that, and because the hemisphere can't get that, you're going to have difficulty moving your left arm or leg appropriately. It could be a potential language issue, so it could be damage to the superior temporal gyrus, wernicke's area, or it could be a Broca issue. Typically, people with language issues will have difficulty following commands. This will usually occur with different types of aphasias. So patients will often tend to use substitutions. So instead of using a toothbrush that is available, they might use their finger instead. Damage to the parietal lobe, the Ware pathway in particular. They may have difficulty integrating sensory information and imitating movements or drawing complex shapes, which might involve spatial processing. What we will typically find for a lot of apraxias is that you actually have impaired integration of sensory and motor information. As I kind of mentioned, for your motor sense, you actually need to have the other senses there to help you figure out where you are and where you need to go. Obviously, I can't show you this clip with the screencast because it won't let me open up videos, so you'll have to check this out yourself. So compare this to an apraxia to something like an ataxia. An ataxia will typically be associated with uncoordinated movements. Typically, this will happen because of cerebellar damage. So as I mentioned, the cerebellum will have several parts that are responsible for different things. So for example, the lateral cerebellum is really important for aspects related to timing. And so if that's damaged, you might develop what is called an intention tremor. So when you're performing an intended movement, you might have shaking or jerky movements, or your timing might be off when you're reaching, so you can't quite reach the object. If you've damaged the vermis, you may experience things like postural instability, weak muscle tone. Remember that the vermis is getting a lot of input from the spinocerebellar tract and the proprioceptors. So they're not able to coordinate their muscles and take account in joint position to help figure that out. They have impaired output to their postural muscles. Postural reflexes will be impaired. Typically, somebody with vermal damage, if you push them over, they can't really widen their stance or tilt in the opposite direction to correct their posture. If you damage the floccular nodular lobe, that is an area that actually gets input from the semicircular canals, the otoliths, and the other parts of the vestibular system. So, because of this, balance will be off. They may experience dizziness, and because of that, they're going to have a very wide, almost drunken sailor's gait with wide bowed legs to basically counterbalance that difficulty maintaining posture. Cerebellar damage can occur for a variety of different reasons. It can occur because of stroke. It can occur because of genetics. It also can happen because of alcoholism. Alcohol will often stimulate GABA activity, which is inhibitory, and that will affect the cerebellum. Temporarily, you're drinking a lot. It's part of the reason why you might see slurred speech when drinking, because the cerebellum is not able to appropriately coordinate the timing of those speech-based movements. So here are a couple of motor disorders you might be curious about. So maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, something that was really popular was something called the ice bucket challenge, where people would dump a bucket of ice to help raise awareness of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. So we call it amyotrophic, meaning without muscle change. Sclerosis means hardening. This has often been referred to as Lou Gehrig's disease. He was a famous baseball player that had it. And basically, what happens with it is progressive neurodegeneration of both upper and lower motor neurons. The onset is typically around age 30 or age 40. It occurs in about 1 in every 100,000 people. And typically, what we will find those lateral motor tracts, the ones that are really critical for dexterity, those smart tracts, tend to be more affected. So as you can kind of see in this image, typically the upper motor neurons tend to start in the primary motor cortex. The lower ones tend to start more in the brainstem, depending on the specific lateral tract. And this means that both voluntary control, because of these tracts in the upper portion, as well as the spinal reflexes, which typically are controlled by things like the cranial nerves, um, are going to be affected. And as a result, they are going to have very substantial effects. So what you're looking at here is a motor neuron, so a standard motor neuron or motor unit in somebody in a normal nerve cell and muscle compared to something with ALS. So what will typically happen is the motor neuron will die and degenerate. The muscle will atrophy after the loss of stimulation. This can occur, there's no specific cause, but some cases do occur in batches. Some people have found that this could happen because of neurotoxins like pesticides used on grass. Gulf War veterans have had twice the risk of other veterans who have a 60% greater chance than the general population. We think that that may be because of some chemicals that they were exposed to. The onset is around 40, but it can occur at any age. The age tends to suggest that there might be some underlying DNA abnormality that only really presents itself when the genetic mutation presents itself. Early things that you will see with ALS include things like weakness, twitching, stiffness, tripping, speech problems. Later on, you will experience things like difficulty walking, paralysis, potential choking because you can't swallow, or suffocation. There's no known cure. One thing I will mention is your cognition is intact. Your brain is still fine. It's just your muscles can't really help you. Treatment, and there has been some treatment in development to kind of slow the death of motor neurons. Most of the treatments are for the symptoms. So it reduces phlegm production, reduces muscle spasms. Typically, death will result from paralysis of the respiratory muscles, the diaphragm, or choking from tongue weakness. And generally, the motor neurons are what are being specifically targeted. You might know A.L.S in particular. It is the disease that the late Stephen Hawking actually had. One other disease that I will talk about before we go is multiple sclerosis. Now, this is a little bit more common. It occurs in about 1 in 700 people. I actually know a few people that have it. Multiple sclerosis does not destroy motor neurons. It attacks the myelin in the central nervous system. It typically tends to be more prevalent in northern climates where there's less light, which is a major source of vitamin D. So make sure you take a multivitamin. If you're going to go outside and use the sun, make sure you have a little bit of sunscreen. Um, it can be caused by viruses as well, including untreated herpes or untreated chlamydia. It can be due to a DNA defect or exposure to neurotoxins, or can develop as a result of smoking. By and large, this happens because oligodendrocytes are destroyed, which means that myelin production cannot continue. Um, Drug treatments will typically include proteins, which boost the action of the immune system. They typically will have the same life expectancy as a healthy population. Most people may lose their ability to walk before they die. And because this is affecting the myelin and it's not selective for motor neurons, you're also going to see cognitive slowing and impairments across a wide variety of domains. So, early things that you might see include weakness, numbness, spasms, speech problems. Later on, you will experience difficulty walking, paralysis, as well as cognitive impairment. And like ALS, there is no known cure. So, unlike A.L.S, which may or may not have pronounced white matter damage, as you can kind of see these little pics, multiple sclerosis actually has a lot. MRI is not really diagnostic for multiple sclerosis, but as you can kind of see in these images, it's pretty useful. You can kind of see the different pics and the different holes in the matter. Okay. There are a couple of videos you can watch on your own time, but that is all I have for you. Hopefully, this helps you with everything you need to know about the motor system before the test. Thanks, and see you later.